This movie is based on a true story. In the first shots, we see Chris waking up his 5-year-old son, Chris Jr. The man has taken the child to kindergarten. Chris never knew his father and made a promise to himself as a child that his children would never experience the same thing. The action is set in San Francisco in 1981. Right now Chris is not having the best time of his life. He tries to sell medical devices, but is unsuccessful. Chris does not have time for anything and asks his wife Linda to pick up the son from kindergarten, but she's busy, too. All day long, Chris has been wandering around the hospitals, hoping to sell something. He really needs the money, because he can't afford even the bare necessities. There are constant scandals with Linda at home because of this. Chris is very tired of being out of money, but he doesn't give up. One day he met a man in an expensive car on the street. He turned out to be a stockbroker. To get this position, it is not necessary to have an education. The main thing is the ability to count and sociability. Everyone around him seems happy and successful, and he is just as good as they are. In the morning, Chris informs the wife of his intention to take an interview at the brokerage firm, because as a child he was easily given mathematical problems. Linda does not believe in her husband's success, considering him a loser. Linda is very tired of this life, because she has been working overtime for 4 months while Chris earns nothing. After asking a hippie woman to look after the equipment, Chris decided to try his luck and went for the interview after all. He was given an application form for an internship. There are a lot of people who want to get this job. Out the window, Chris saw the hippie stealing his equipment and rushed to catch up. He did not have time to stop the thief, as she entered the subway car. Every 6 months the firm recruits 20 interns, but only one of them gets on the staff. Chris doubted that he would succeed, since he had no education. Soon Chris took the completed form to the brokerage firm. Jay Twistle, the head of the personnel department, promised to call back. Suddenly Chris saw the same hippie in the crowd who had earlier stolen his equipment, and he ran after her. This was a big deal to Chris, for he had spent all his savings on this equipment, thinking it would bring him success. He managed to get his property back after all. When Linda saw that he had sold nothing, she was upset. It is the son's birthday, but Linda was not at all happy about the celebration. In the evening, Chris tried to talk to her, but she was in no mood to listen to his promises. A month later, Chris approached Mr. Twistle and asked if they would consider him for the job. Jay was in a hurry, so Chris got in a cab with him. He tried his best to make an impression. Jay meanwhile unsuccessfully tried to assemble the Rubik's Cube, which has now become very popular. When Chris did it, Mr. Twistle was shocked and called the guy a genius. Since Mr. Twistle forgot to pay the cab driver and Chris was short of money, he had to run away. However, the cab driver continued to chase him, first on the street and then on the subway. As Chris's hand got stuck in the door, he had to drop the equipment. Karma caught up with him. Later, he called the wife from a landline and apologized for not picking up the child from kindergarten. Linda declared that she and the son were leaving him. Chris couldn't let his family break up. He rushed home, but found neither the wife nor the son there. Neither were their belongings in the closets. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Jay Twistle. He had scheduled an interview for Chris. The next morning, Chris came to Linda's work. He was ready to let his wife go, but forbade her to take the son. Chris came to pick him up in kindergarten before Linda did. He could not allow the child to live apart from him. In the evening, Charlie, the landlord, knocked on the door. Chris couldn't afford to pay the rent. Charlie gave him a deadline of 1 week and told him to paint the walls instead of hiring painters. Soon Chris was arrested, so he owes back taxes. He asks to be released because he has no one to leave the son with and he has the job interview tomorrow, but the police are adamant. Chris had no choice but to ask Linda to take the son away for the day. In the morning, when Chris was released, he rushed to the interview. He didn't have time to change. The office was in turmoil. When Chris was invited for a talk, everyone was embarrassed by his unpresentable appearance. Chris decided to tell the whole truth. Mr. Twistle and his colleagues liked his persistence. A few minutes later, Jay told Chris the good news. He had been hired for a probationary period. But what Chris didn't know was that he would have to work without pay for the entire internship. Jay gave Chris time to think about it. He has to make a decision by this evening. Chris didn't know what he was going to do. Because of the 20 people who would take the course, only one would join the staff. In the evening, Linda brought the son. Suddenly she announced that she was moving to New York and leaving the child here. Chris called Mr. Twistle's secretary back to let him know he was ready for the internship. While the son slept, Chris packed bags, for he had no money to pay the rent on the house. The very next day they moved into a motel. From now on, father and son live without Linda. They went out to sell the medical equipment together. Today Chris managed to sell one apparatus and made some money. At the same time, he began training at the brokerage firm. Out of all the trainees, only the best will be chosen. At the end of the probationary period, an exam awaits them. During a break, Chris saw a hobo with his equipment and ran after him, getting hit by a car. Fortunately, Chris survived, but lost his other shoe. He had to go back to the office looking like that. All day long, Chris was learning the brokerage business. He also had to be an errand boy for the manager. The rest of the time he called potential clients. After training, he would rush to the subway to pick up his son from kindergarten. The owner of the motel, Ralph, constantly reminded of late payments. The most important task of all trainees is to get as many clients as possible in 6 months. Chris had to work 6 hours instead of 9, or he wouldn't have time to pick up his son from kindergarten. One day he got up the courage to call Walter Ribbon, the pension fund manager. Surprisingly, he agreed to meet. Even though Chris was in a hurry, the manager asked him to move his car out of the parking lot. Unfortunately, Chris got stuck in traffic and was late for an appointment. In addition, the car was ticketed for improper parking. Chris has to pay the fine himself. He promised the son to go to a soccer game together if they could sell the equipment. Even though Chris was very nervous, he dared to ring Mr. Ribbon's doorbell. It turned out that Walter and his son Tim are also going to a soccer game. Walter suggested that Chris and his child join them. Of course, Chris agreed. They had a good time, but Walter was in no hurry to use the services of the brokerage firm. But Chris was able to meet a few more potential clients. After the match, he and his son returned home. Nights on end, Chris studied economics. Within 4 months he had sold all of his remaining medical equipment. The money he earned should be enough for 2 more months. Chris thought everything was going well, but one day he got a letter. $600 in back taxes came due. Chris's bank account was seized, and he and the son were left without any means of livelihood. In the morning, Ralph demands payment for the motel room, but Chris has nothing to pay. He doesn't know what he should do now. Suddenly, when Chris brings his son to the playground, he sees the hobo with the stolen medical equipment again. In the metro, Chris brought the apparatus into proper condition, but it was not possible to sell it. The apparatus would not turn on. When Chris and his son returned, they found their belongings near the door. Apparently Ralph got tired of the constant promises and just evicted them. They found themselves on the street without a livelihood. The son began to be cranky, and Chris didn't know how to calm him down. The father and son had to go to the subway station because there was nowhere else to go. They ended up having to spend the night in a public restroom. The son fell asleep, and Chris cried with helplessness. The next day they went to a shelter for the homeless. The owner said that they only accept women and children, so they could only give a bed to a boy. Chris was not happy with that option, so the woman gave him another address where they can be helped. There was a huge line. Suddenly an employee announced that there were only 4 seats left. A fight broke out between the vagrants, but Chris managed to get a seat after all. Chris washed his son and put him to bed. When the child fell asleep, Chris tried to fix the equipment. However, it was difficult to do so in the poor light. In addition, Chris continued to study economics. During the day, Chris worked in the office meeting with clients, and by 5 he took a place at the homeless shelter to get a bed for the night. This life was very hard for his son. Finally, exam day came. Afterward, Chris crossed paths in the elevator with a colleague, who panicked when he found out that the back of the exam sheet also had questions on it. Outside, the boss asked Chris for $5 for a cab. For Chris, every dollar counted, but he had no choice but to comply with the request. Chris had to become a blood donor to get some money. Now he was able to buy parts to fix the light bulb on the apparatus. The son asked why the mother had left them. Chris said that sometimes in the lives of adults there are such circumstances. Finally, Chris was able to fix the equipment after all. The very next day he sold it and made $250. The father and son moved back into the motel. For the first time in many days, Chris was able to get a good night's sleep. One day after work, he was walking with his son by the sea. Chris liked being away from people and hustle. It was the only way he could take his mind off his own failings. Finally, the decisive moment came. The internship was over. Chris could not believe that out of all 20 interns his candidacy had been approved. Chris couldn't help himself and cried in a burst of emotion. The boss, by the way, returned the debt of $5 to him. For the first time in a long time, Chris felt truly happy. He picked up his son early from kindergarten to hug him. Now everything is going